Chapter 3 starts off with us beginning to shift gears a little bit in this book of John. Because in the first 2 chapters of this book that he writes, he introduces this idea about living in the light and this new commandment that Jesus has given us. And when he talks about living in the light, he's talking about this idea of what it looks like for us that follow Jesus to follow him. And he says this in verse 10. He says, if we claim we have not sinned, we are calling God a liar and showing that his word has no place in our hearts, showing that every single believer of Jesus still yet is going to sin and fall short. But then he switches gears a little bit. We come into chapter 3, and what happens is you see in verses 5 and 6, he actually brings up a little bit of a contradiction. In verses 5 it says, and you know that Jesus came to take away our sins, and there is no sin in him. Anyone who continues to live in him will not sin, but anyone who keeps on sinning does not know him or understand who he is. So why would John do this? Why would John start off a letter saying one thing and right in the middle of his own letter, while he's talking, actually create almost an argument back to what he is saying? Why in the world would John do something like this? And the answer is just really simple. He's a really good writer. This is what good writing does. Because what he's not doing, he's not taking these ideas and say they should fight against each other and only one's going to be right. What he's saying is these 2 ideas we need to take in together and we need to think about and talk about and begin to address with the Lord and see what he means by this. Because if we begin to walk through what he's saying right here, verse 6 does say, anyone who continues to live in him will not sin, but anyone who keeps on sinning does not know him or understand who he is. But if you keep on reading, you see in verse 9 that it says, those who have been born into God's family do not make a practice of sinning because God's life is in them. So they can't keep on sinning because they are children of God. Yet again, John is not saying here that we are never going to sin again. That's not what he's saying. What he is saying is what we're going to read in verse 10. Is he's saying, so now we can tell who are children of God and who are children of the devil. Anyone who does not live righteously and does not love other believers does not belong to God. What he is saying here, though, is that we who have a new identity in Jesus don't live in sin. And the really cool thing about this is it's a very big shift of perspective, because we go from this idea, this perspective of living to not sin, right? Which is sometimes how we live life. We live out this idea of, okay, I just want to make sure I don't sin today. We go from that perspective, shifting into something new. And this new perspective is, how can I begin to try to live as pure as I can? Because all throughout the book of John, this first, second, third, and especially even the Gospel of John, all throughout it, you see this correlation between living pure, being God's child, and loving others. Because there is a direct correlation between righteous living pure, and loving others, because they go actually hand in hand. And this is how he sets up this chapter. The first half talks about righteous living, and the second half talks about loving others. And so we're going to walk through this righteous living in just a second, but I want to begin to touch on this loving others. Because you see in the second half of this chapter, verses 11, 14, 16, 18, and 23 all say the same thing with roughly the same phrase of make sure to love one another. But I want to talk about this idea because part of loving people is learning how to seek Jesus more than we seek ourselves. And what I mean by that is this. When you look at your Instagram, who is the main person you see on there? You. When you look through your camera roll, who's the main person of all these pictures that is taken? You. And who is the person in your life that you like to talk about the most, if you're honest? You. Now, these are totally human tendencies. Each and every single human on this earth is going to do that. That's something that just naturally and comes out of us, right? But we're actually not called to live like every other human on this earth. We're called to live like Jesus. And what would it look like for us to begin to care and love people as much as we begin to love ourselves, right? And love yourself isn't meaning, I think so much high stuff about me, I just love everything about me. Loving yourself is how much time do you spend thinking about who you are and yourself? That's an act of love to you. And so how much time do you do that? And what if we begin to spend all that time that we spent with creating Instagram photos or talking about ourselves or taking pictures of ourselves, which yet again are very natural tendencies, what if we could begin to spend that much time in investing in loving others as much? What if I begin to do that? Because the beginning of chapter 3 nails that idea. And it says this: "See how very much our Father loves us, for he calls us his children, and that is what we are." Understanding that we are God's children and that he loves us is the first step into beginning to live a life of loving others. Because I firmly believe we all want to love others well. I actually firmly believe that. But sometimes we have to begin to put in the effort to do that well. And that effort looks like understanding and believing that the Father loves us and now considers us his children, right? If you watched our live stream, we got to talk about this idea of God pursuing us and how God's love for us changes us. And this new identity is the same identity right here that John is talking about that we're called to live into. Because when you understand that you're loved and that you're sought after and that you're pursued, it's so much easier and so much more natural to love others. And I want to end with this story. See, these short books, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and the Gospel of John, and actually the book of Revelation, are all written by the same guy, this apostle John. And this guy, he is actually the only apostle to actually survive and not be condemned to death because of him preaching the gospel. He's the only one. And so while he's walking through and while he's living life, he's getting to the near end of his life. And he's actually exiled to a certain island. I don't quite remember the name of it. And while he's exiled on this island, he's sitting there and he's preaching the gospel, talking to people about Jesus, and there's actually a church there. And John, in his old age, he begins to write these letters in the gospel and Revelation. And because he has so much wisdom and God's done so much transformation, he's just seen really who Jesus is, and he wants to help people out and understand that better, right? Well, so he writes these letters when he's later on in age in life, and then he still yet continues to live on. And as he begins to continue to live on after he writes these letters, both his physical and his mental state begin to deteriorate. And he's still a part of this church. He's still a part of this group of believers. And this group of believers, they always bring him in. They always want him to be a part of what's going on, and they always ask him for his advice. And it gets to the point when he's later on in life, after he's written these letters, they begin to ask him for his advice. And there's one certain phrase that he says over and over and over and over and over again every time they ask him. And he says, "Love one another, love one another, love one another, love one another." And for the first couple of times that this happened, they're like, yeah, sweet, that's actually good advice, that's awesome. What ends up happening is that they start to actually get discouraged by what John is saying. And so they eventually ask him, "John, why do you keep on saying this? Why do you keep on just bringing this idea?" And he says, "Because if you love others, that is good enough. You've done it." And so this idea of loving others and knowing that we're loved, that is enough. So we challenge you today, love others, because yet again, that is enough.